actually, the Rebbe talks about it, but really, essentially, the laws of carrying of the most central laws in Shabbos. That's the biggest change you basically need to make from regular life. It's the least intuitive rest that you would imagine. I'm just carrying something outside, making it convenient. Yet the Torah is so clear on how liable you are and how. So, what is a Rishus Harabim? What is considered a public domain? So here's what it says. Midbaris, the wilderness, deserts, forests, fields, open streets, as long as they are 16 cubits wide and there's no roof. Those are considered a public domain, right? So the streets outside are considered public domain. Now I want to note that other rabbis disagree with the Rambam. They say you have to have 600,000 people passing through that area to make it public domain, but the Rambam does not bring that as a condition. So now the rule is that an eruv, if you want to put a string around the city, it doesn't work if there's 600,000 people passing through the area. So there's a lot of debate. What is 600,000 people passing through one street, one space, one this, one that? Is it passing through an area? Is it living in the area? Potentially, there's a lot of debate about that. But the Rambam doesn't bring that as a condition. So the Rambam is quite strict about what a public domain is, and we'll see later on when we get to the laws of eruvs. Okay, so if there's a roof over it, though, it's no longer public domain. What is, and again, we're defining the law, these aren't property laws, these are Shabbos laws. So we're not, this is public, private. Property laws, speaking with a lawyer would be totally different. Okay. What is a private domain? A private domain is if you have like a mound, which is 10 handbreadths, it's about 32 inches high, and it was wide 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, or more than that. And similarly, a ditch in the ground, like a trench, which is deep 10 and wide. So you either have a platform which is 10 handbreadths high and 4 by 4, or a trench which is 10 deep and 4 by 4, or more than that. And similarly, something which is surrounded by 4 walls, and the walls are high 10 handbreadths, and between them there is 4 by 4 handbreadths or more. Even if it is many, many million, even if it's very, very big area, if it is surrounded for the place of living, for example, a city, this is a neighborhood which they gated community, and people are living there. And also, if you have alleys which have 3 walls and a lechi, we'll talk about that later, and there's a certain type of beam in the fourth side, and similarly a courtyard or different places which are surrounded for living, those are considered a private domain. So a private domain has 4 walls and has to be used for living. Okay. Even vessels, for example, a boat or a tower, or a wooden block, all these things, if they have 4 by 4 and they're 10 tall, they are a private domain. So, therefore, if you're walking in the street, right, or you're standing in the street, and there's this big piece of wood in front, and it's 32 inches tall, and it's more than 4 by 4, and you put something on it, you have taken something from a public domain and put it in a private domain. Okay, the width of the walls of the private domain, they follow the status of the private domain. For others, it makes walls. For themselves, for sure, they're walls. The air of a private domain is like a private domain.
What do you mean, the air?
The air. So when you pass something into the air of a private domain, that's passing it into a private domain.
What if it's only 10 fucking tall?
Questions
and
after.
You go and you build a tower and
You'll see after. Okay, if you have a private domain, it's private domain air is considered private domain until the sky. But the air of a public domain is not considered public only until 10 handbreadths high. So after 10 handbreadths high, so if you have a table, right, and it's less than 4 by 4 in a private domain, this table here, it's more than 32 inches high, let's say, it's considered private domain. So if you put something from outside onto the table, you're liable. On the other hand, if it's in the public domain, if it's higher than 10 handbreadths, it's not considered public anymore. All right. So 1 second. Now the area on top of 10 tvachim in a public domain, if it is more than 4 by 4, like a car, then it's a private. Then it's a private domain. If it's less than 4 by 4, it's called a makim patur. It's an exempt place. It's a new status. It's not public, and it's not private.
What is that?
That is higher than 10 handbreadths, less than 4 by 4.
And
Yeah.
what is an exempt
What is
space? What does that mean?
Exempt space, we'll see soon what it means. It means it's not public and it's not private. Okay, so, oh, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll wait.
There are 4 types of domains on Shabbos. There's the Rishus Yachid, the public domain, the private domain. There's the public domain. There's a third domain called a Carmelis, and we'll introduce the Carmelis soon. And then there is the Makim Pator. Makim Pator is, again, the exempt domain. Now, what is a Carmelis? A Carmelis is a new term that we're bringing in. You have a mound, which is 4 by 4, or more than that, and it is higher than 3, but lower than 10. Once it's over 10 handbreadths, which is like 31 inches, let's say, then 32 inches, then it becomes its own private domain. But under that, above 3, if it's within 3, it's considered the street, the public domain. If it's between 3 and 10, it is called a Carmelis. Carmelis only goes until 10 tfachim, until 10 handbreadths, and it is not wider, less than 4 by 4. So similarly, if you have a hole in the ground, which is 4 by 4 or more width, right? 4 by 4 or more width, and it is deep between 3 and 10. It's deep 7 handbreadths. And similarly, a place that has 4 walls, and the walls are from 3 to 10, and between them there's 4 by 4. There's a space of 4 by 4 handbreadths, right? And similarly, like a corner thing which is next to the a corner which is next to the public domain, and it has 3 walls. So you have like a little, in the side street. In the street, you have like 3 walls, and the 4th one is Rosh Hashanah. For example, a mava is an alley which doesn't have anything on the 4th side. And similarly, oceans, and fields in summer and winter, these are all Carmelis. So what is a Carmelis? I'll just introduce and summarize it. A Carmelis is something which is not public and people don't use publicly, but it's not a private space.
And it's not like
So
It's not exempt?
So it is not exempt. Now we're going to explain it. It's not an exempt place. So you can't carry there, but it's not a public domain. So it's a rabbinic ordinance that you can't carry there. So we'll give more ideas of this.
So it's not public, not private, and not exempt.
Yes. Okay. The air of a Carmelis, it is like the Carmelis until 10 tfachim. So the air of a Carmelis. So here, let's say you have this table outside, and let's say that's 21 inches off the ground. So it's not private domain. It's not a public domain because it's above 3 handbreadths from the ground. It's a Carmelis. That is only till 10, and the air on top is only till 10. Only a Carmelis until 10. And higher than 10, it is a exempt place. Therefore, on top of the ocean and top of rivers until 10 handbreadths are Carmelis, and higher than that, they're exempt. However, the whole water of an ocean or river or lake, that is considered like the top of the water is considered like the top of a field.
which is a Carmelis.
Yes. All right. Now, if you have a ditch, a hole in the ground in a Carmelis, a pit, it is like a Carmelis, even if it is 100 amas and it is wide 100 amas. A pit in a Carmelis, even if it's more than 4 by 4. So, if you have a hole in the ground and if it's more than 4 by 4, even and it's very very deep, it keeps the status of Carmelis.
What?
If you have a public domain,
No.
wait. If you have a public domain which has a roof on top of it, or it's not 16, we said that a public domain has to be 16 cubits, which is 24 feet wide, then it's a Carmelis. So if you have like a street, a public street, and there's a roof on top, it is not considered a public street in the laws of Shabbos. It's considered a Carmelis.
Like sometimes there's bridges, covered bridges.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, if you have a platform between posts in a public place, this is a Carmelis. The sides of a Rosh Hashanah, so let's say you have a public street, and you have all these side streets, those are all considered a Carmelis. But between the columns, since a lot of people go there, this is considered a Rosh Hashanah. So again, if it's part of the public street, then it's considered part of the public domain. If it goes off, then it's considered a Carmelis. Now the Rambam is going and he's classifying these 4 things. Then we'll talk about carrying between them. What is a Makim Pator? A exempt place. A place is less than 4 by 4, and it's higher then 3 until the sky. Anything lower than 3 handbreadths is considered the ground. Even if they're spiky, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's manure or things like that, people aren't going to walk on it. And it's 3 high, and there's not less than 4. This is a makom patur. So even if it's something that you trash, you wouldn't want here. It's still considered its own exempt place. And the depths of from 3 until the ground. And similarly, places which are surrounded, which don't have 4 by 4, even if it is long, 1,000 mil, but it's wide, less than 4, then this is just slightly less than 4. This is considered exempt place. Similarly, the air of Rosh Hashanah or the air of a Carmelist higher than 10, the air of a public domain and the air of a Carmelist higher than 10 is considered an exempt place. Somewhere where there's 9 tefachim exactly, no more, no less, in a public domain.
9 tefachim what?
A place which has the height of 9 tefachim exactly, no less and no more. In a Rosh Hashanah, it's like the Rosh Hashanah, and you don't look at the length of the width, whether it's wide or long, because a lot of people use it. So something which is 9 handbreadths, people use that in the public places. They use it to put stuff on or to rest on it and everything. However, if it's more than 9 or less, if it is 4 by 4, it is a Carmelist, and if it is less, it is a makom patur. So exception is exactly 9. A roof which is next to a Rosh Hashanah within a public domain. Sorry for using the Hebrew terms. A roof which is next to the public domain within 10 tefachim, within 10 handbreadths. Since people use it, you cannot carry on the roof until you make a set ladder, permanent ladder to permit it. A post in a Rosh Hashanah, a post in a public domain, which is 10 and wide 4. This is a private domain. If you put something on that, so you're walking, and this is higher than 10 handbreadths, and you put something on that, even if it is not higher than 3, since it's made to hang things on, this makes it less than 10, and therefore it is a Carmelist. And you don't you measure from the foundation to above. From like the hook, I guess, right? Let's see.
It says peg, its height.
So you have the pegs that you're hanging
on those pegs.
Yeah. So even if it's full of pegs, this makes it lower because you can hang on it in the place of the peg. So let's say the thing is 10 high and you're hanging lower than 10. That's not a Rosh Hashanah. That's not a private domain. So I just want to, before we go a little further, what does this mean practically? You're walking in the street. You're not allowed to carry outside. So now, if you are carrying something outside, and there's a little table, if the table is less than 4 by 4, right, then you will be exempt. But if it's higher than 10 and more than 4 by 4, you will be liable, right? So if this table will be outside and you'll put something on it, you'll be liable if it's higher than 10. Now, if there's things that people hang things on in the public domain, we measure that thing, even though we can measure, hey, it's on a post which is this high, maybe that makes the whole thing a private domain. Okay. The holes in a private domain, on like the wall and stuff like that, this is like a private. If you have holes in the wall that people use for things, this is like a private domain. But the Rosh Hashanah, if they're holes in a public domain, in a wall or whatever it is to put stuff, we measure them. For example, if it's on the side of Rosh Hashanah, if there's 4 by 4 in this hole, it is a private domain. And if it's not higher than 10, it is a Carmelist. And if it doesn't have 4 by 4, it's an exempt place. And this is so as long as it's higher than 3, because anything lower than 3 is like the ground. A private domain and an exempt place, right? If you are an exempt place or a private domain, you are allowed to carry in them, even if they are long, very, very long. So if you have, technically speaking, you have, let's say a railroad track, and it's higher than 3. It's higher than 3, and it's not wide 4, but it's long forever. You can technically walk on that balance beam and carry on that on Shabbos.
Seriously?
So as long as it's higher than 3, and you don't get hit by the train. Okay. However, In a public domain, in a Carmelis, you cannot. So again, a public domain is a place which is wider than a street, wider than 16 amas, which is 24 feet, and a Carmelis is a place which is less than that amount, but it's not higher than 10 high. So you can't carry that except for 4 amas. You can carry 4 amas in those places. And if you pass something or throw something out of the 4 amas in a Rishus Harabim, in a public domain, remember we spoke yesterday, if you throw something more than 6 feet, you're liable. But in a Carmelis, you will be exempt. Because Carmelis is rabbinical decree, because it's not similar it's similar to a Rishus Harabim, similar to a public domain, and maybe you'll mix up. And therefore, if you don't need to carry it, for example, let's say you have, so here's a good example. Let's say there's something that people will get hurt if they walk on, step on, a thorn in a public domain. You can't move it on Shabbos more than 4 amos. But in a private domain, if you don't benefit from the carrying, you can move it. Now, I'll just give you an example. Let's say you have a park. A park has a fence around it. A park is not a private domain because it is not made for living, right? So now let's say there's something that will hurt people if they touch it or step on it. In a park, you could move it because you're not benefiting from the carrying itself. In other words, you're just trying to remove something. But on the street, you cannot. Okay. Now, just like it's permitted to carry something in a exempt place, a makom patur, you can also enter from there into Rishus Harabim or into Rishus Yachid. And for sure into a Carmelis, and you take from the public domain, the private domain, and from the public domain, and you don't have to say from a Carmelis. So I just want to give you an example. Let's say you're walking on Shabbos and you find something in your pocket. What should you do? Does that remember from yesterday?
Keep walking.
You're walking in public domain, keep walking, because once you stop, you've carried it, and right? So what you can do is you can find something less than 10 tfachim, ideally less than 4 by 4, like let's say a fire hydrant if it's less than 32 inches, and you can put that object on that, and now you have not sinned. You haven't done. You're not liable. You got that? Or you can find. Let's say you find a fence. Some fences they have like multiple layers. So in the lower layer of the fence, right, or the higher layer of the fence, since it's not 10 by 10, you can put on that fence. So as long as it's not surrounding a private domain, you can put on that fence, and you were considered. It's permitted. It's permitted to do that. Okay. Okay, so now we said you can also take from a makom patur, a place which is exempt, into a private domain or into public domain. So technically speaking, if you take from a private domain into a place which is exempt, and then from there into a place which is a public domain, then you didn't do anything wrong. Just like, just like you're not allowed to carry in a Carmelis. A Carmelis, we said, is basically a public domain, similar to a public domain, but it doesn't have all the attributes of a public domain. So just like it's forbidden to carry in a Carmelis, you can also not take from a private domain into a public domain into a Carmelis, because a Carmelis is half private, half public, and the rabbi said this will get confusing for people, so therefore you shouldn't carry outside at all. It doesn't matter where, it doesn't matter what. If you, let's say you take from a private domain to public domain, or from a public to a private, and there is a Carmelis in between, then you are exempt. And similarly, if you pass from them and there's a Carmelis, you are exempt. If you take from a public domain to a Carmelis, and you put it there, and then you take it from the Carmelis into the Rishus Yachid, into the private domain, or you take from the private domain to the Carmelis and you leave it there, and then you take from the Carmelis and you take it to the public domain, this is exempt. If you take from a private domain to a public domain, and you pass by a makom patur, and you're walking, right? So let's say I'm walking from indoors to outdoors, and there's like this, there's this step outdoors, right? So this is an exempt place, and I step on that, I am liable, because so as long as you're walking, it's not considered as if you put it down, right? So it's considered as if you take from the private to public, it doesn't matter what's in between. Similarly, if you throw over it, for sure, doesn't matter. You throw over, we don't say, hey, it went through a exempt domain, right? If you're standing in a exempt place, makom patur, and you take it from a private domain, or for someone standing there and you put it in the public domain, or the hand of the person who's standing there, you're exempt. And similarly, if you put from a Rishus Harabim to Rishus Yachid, if you bring it there and you stand, so let's you're walking from the private domain to the public domain, and you stop in the exempt domain, then you are exempt from any punishment. a pillar or post in a public domain which is 10 high and 4 by 4, and in the bottom there's no 4 by 4, and and there is not in the height of it 3 hand breadths. This is a Rosh Hashanah, and if you throw and it lands on it, you're liable. A Tela Mislaket is a mound of dirt which is 10 high. So you have this pile of dirt, right? Now, here's the thing. If you'll take this pile of dirt, it is for sure 10 handbreadths higher than the ground, right? But there's an incline, right? There's an incline. So what place do we measure the 10? In other words, you can look, it's getting a little higher, a little higher, a little higher, right? So this is the law of Tel HaMislaket. If it's 10 high, if it becomes 10 high within 4 tfachim, within 4 amas, within 6 feet. So in other words, the incline from 0 to 10 is within 6 feet. So then that's considered a reshus haryachid. And if you throw on top of it, but let's say it's a slower incline, right over 10 feet, a hill, then it's not considered a private domain on top. It will be considered a carmelis because we only measure the 10 tfachim, the 10 head brands, if they're within 6 feet, 4 amas, 4 cubits. Okay. If you have a post in a public domain, even if it's 100 high and you throw on top and it lands on top, it is considered a private domain. A tree which is in a private domain and its branches go to a public domain, right? So even though if it would land on the top of the tree in the private domain, you'd be liable. The branches do not consider, those are considered out of the private domain. So you'll be exempt. If you have a post in a public domain and on top there's like a basket and you throw on top of it, you're exempt because it's not Rosh Hashanah until so you have a post in a public domain and on top there's a basket and you throw on top of it, you're exempt because it's not Rosh Hashanah until only until it's 10. If you throw 4 amas and it lands in a wall, for example, let's say you throw dough or fat or slime and it lands on a wall. If it's higher than 10, this is like throwing it in the air. That higher than 10 is a exempt place. If it's lower than 10, then you are, it's like throwing it in the ground and you're liable. If it's higher than 10 and it lands in a hole, then you are exempt, even though the hole is considered the private domain. If you throw a branch or a stick or a spear from the private domain and it lands in the public domain, standing, you're exempt because some of it is in the exempt place. If you throw from a private domain to a public domain, and it was a very big vessel, and it lands in and it was a very big vessel, and it's 4 by 4, 10, you're exempt because this actual object is 10 tfachim. So, let's say you have a big inflatable bounce house, and you throw it from this thing itself is its own rishus. It's its own. And comes out, you're taking from a private domain to a private domain. If you have a pit which is 9 hand breadths in a public domain, and you dig a little bit and it becomes 10, even though, so now, what are you doing? If you dig, you're taking the dirt or taking whatever's at the bottom from an area which is 10 hand breadths, right? Because the pit is 9 hand breadths. 9 hand breadths we said is a carmelis. If it will be 10 deep, then it will be a private domain. So if you're digging out, you're inadvertently making a private domain. So maybe I'm taking out of the private domain. You're exempt because it comes at once. It comes at once because you didn't have 10 while the walls of the pit weren't 10 high while you're doing it. If it was 10 and you throw something in and it becomes 9, you're exempt because you're making an exempt place at the same exact time that you're putting something in. If you have a board, you throw it and it lands on posts in a public domain, and now it becomes a reshus hayachid, even if there's a vessel on top. Then, so you have posts here, but they're not 4 by 4. Now you're throwing something on top which is 4 by 4. So you're making a reshus hayachid. You're making a private domain, even if there's something on top of this board. You are exempt because the reshus hayachid and the private domain and the thing putting there is happening at once. If you have a pit which is 10 and it's wide 8. In a public domain, and you throw a fabric from a public domain, and it covers over, smooths it out, you're exempt because putting the vessel on makes the walls go away, And okay, if you have so if you have a pit and it has walls, right, which are 10 high, right? So now they go up Rosh Hashanah forever, and now you put something, and now there's no more walls, there's no more pit. You're exempt. Okay. A pit in a public domain which is 10 deep and wide 4, and it's full of water, and you throw something in it, and it lands on top of the water. So you have, let's say, a well in a public domain, and you put something on top. You are liable because the water doesn't take away the walls. Even if it's full of fruits and you throw inside, however, if it's full of fruits and you throw something on top, you're exempt because the fruit does make it no longer a private domain. Okay.
Swampy water.
Now you have, let's say, like a spring, you have a little creek going through the public domain, and many people walk over it or through it. If it is not 10 deep, it's like a Rosh Hashanah, whether it is wide 4 amas, whether it's not wide 4 tvachim, because people jump over it and they don't go in it, and it's not 10 deep, it's considered like a public domain. Only if the stream is deep enough will we consider it to be a private domain. However, if there's 10 or more, it's like a carmelis, like other oceans, and this is so long, so this is a running stream, this is so long as there's 4 or more, because there's no carmelis less than 4. 1 second.
That's the end of it.
Yeah. Okay, that is the end of the laws. That is the end of today's laws. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the maamer. Just gonna say, any questions?
Just, this is not
So I just want to tell you, when Jews keep Shabbos,
not expected to remember these details. They just refrain altogether, right?
yeah. So it's important to remember that people refrain, and the thing about it is a lot of these laws on Shabbos. So first of all, it's like if you were and you forgot a Shabbos, then these laws are very relevant. You would ask a rabbi in the temple times, you say, am I liable or not? Even nowadays you would ask, because if you're liable, you sin. You got to do teshuvah. But really all these things create you in a new Shabbos mode. So really you don't want to carry outside. You don't want to come to a place, is this considered rabbinic or biblical? Should I carry here? Am I allowed to carry here? Now it is important to know that if you find something in your pocket, right, don't stop. Because once you stop, you have to put it down on the ground, because it's considered that you put it down. And, we'll see later, what if you're wearing tefillin and Shabbos comes, what do? You don't want to put them down, or something holy. And then once you stop, you could technically go and put it down every 6 feet, every 5 feet, you can go put it down and move it that way. Ideally, if it's something, let's say you find cash in your pocket, you're not supposed to carry it on Shabbos. So you ideally want to find something which is less than 10 or less than 4 by 4, and you could put it down on that thing, and that way you will not violate Shabbos. But I just want to say, these things are prime importance to traditional Jews.
You're not supposed to touch your money.
Not supposed to touch your money, but if you're carrying it, you're allowed to. As we'll see later, the law of not touching money is rabbinic, and the law of carrying is biblical. The law of carrying is biblical. So the rabbis obviously say that if you're protecting a biblical law, here we don't need this now, Mendel. The rabbis obviously say that if you're protecting a biblical law, then you should, a biblical law, you can violate the rabbinic law.
One of your examples, you talked about a park being defined as a public place. What if, there are schleppers in the park and they sleep there and they eat there? Does that change the status of the park?
It might. Do they have permission? There are different questions. Do they have permission? How set up are they? How often do they stay there? You know what I mean? If they stay there every night and they got all their stuff there and their barbecue and all their food and everything and stuff there, and they're there for there's probably amount of time. How long have they been there for? Because if they're just moving around, then no. And there are cases where people get stuck and they don't, they're stuck on Shabbos, and that's okay. It's okay to be stuck. God's with you. So again, these laws here, in other words, if you can avoid carrying things outside in totality, you won't have to get into the details of what type of domain is this, what type of domain is that. there are a lot of different details of, like private domain doesn't necessarily mean private property,
Right.
right? So you might have your front yard is actually could be part of public domain, or at least a carmelis. At least it's considered the rabbinic domain. So these are all the different laws that exist. You know, interesting law. Your car is likely a private domain inside, right? So if you can leave your keys in your car, right, then you know. So there are all these different things to be conscious of.
Are you allowed to carry the hallways of a hotel?
That's Hilchas Erevin. That's
No,
Hilchas
are you
Erevin.
allowed
Depends
to-
what type of hotel.
What's the
Depends-
barrier? What's the barrier?
Which area? It
Barrier.
depends what you do. It depends what the hotel. It depends a lot of things.
Stay inside. Read your Torah. Stay inside, read your Torah.
Well, it's a private domain, but the area inside is technically a private domain biblically, but the area
Looks
inside.
like God's trying to slow you down a little bit.
Because like anyone can walk there and everything like that.
Anyone could.
Yeah.
It's
So,
a state of-
Which
so,
minor
so
was
sometimes you
that?
have to put some. The answer is. The answer to your question. The answer to your question.
Got that all?
The answer to your question.
Get all
is
that,
Sometimes
Paul?
you have to put a
Oh,
sometimes.
It's all memorized. My brain is like
memorize that?
15 years
Here,
old.
it's probably
Do
okay.
you?
No.
Oh, okay, I'm going like that, pretty good. I gotta hang around a little bit.
Give me 1 second, let me just look at the book.
Think how we have.
I didn't know
we
you were a
have
joker.
well-defined buildings and places.
Yeah.
Now we
Because
will.
otherwise, yeah, it would be way too confusing.
I don't know, I'm thinking like, all these scenarios could have variations and things like, you know, that
Well, this is what
would
the
make it
rabbi-
impossible to really move around.
This was
Or
part
stop
of
moving.
Satan.
Whichever.
We'll start with the
Keep
Hummus.
moving, wait till the
I think I'm
shabbos
gonna
is
go live
over.
out in the desert, so I don't have to worry about any of it.
What would that be like? Would that be like an
This is what-
exile?
Oh, yeah.
We are already in the
Well, I know, but would that act of continuing walking so that you don't sin, is that a reenactment of the exile? I'm serious.
What do you mean?
You're lying.
Huh?
You know, well, yes.
You're on YouTube.
Yeah, he's live on YouTube. What's your question? You
Oh,
said you're live on YouTube.
there was this, the notion of you keep walking, you know, and that somehow it prevents the sin, and the thought that came to mind was the exile and leaving Egypt, not in haste and keep going. Is there some kind of connection there? Or is that just my imagination?
You know, there's not, okay, so there's two things. I mean, there's the legal ramifications of Jewish law, but there is a lot talking about this law on Shabbos. Because when you go through the laws of Shabbos, generally there's a certain logic to them. And then you get to the laws of carrying, which is so vast and difficult, and, you know, it's like seems so ridiculous, right? You can't carry outside. You can carry inside. If you have an indoor park, you can walk hundreds of miles, indoor house, and it's 1 million square feet, you can walk as far as you want, but you just can't carry 1 inch outside. You know, that's sin. And not only it's a sin, but you might get death penalty. So there is a lot of commentators on a metaphysical form talk about the laws, how essentially this is the most important laws of Shabbos. And the essence of Shabbos is the private domain is God's space, and the public domain is the space of work. And on Shabbos, we focus on the private domain. We don't mix them, and we go out of the place of work. So there is a lot. So what you're saying is, I don't know in particular about keeping going, but there is a lot of metaphysical explanation to these laws that Rambam doesn't go into. He's just going to the practical legalities of it. But yeah, it definitely is a very, very interesting law. You know, I apologize. I was trying to print it this morning. I just couldn't get the AI chapter 3 here. I don't know why, but we'll get to chapter 4 today.
So is this something we had before?
Yes, it's the regular maamer, and I have one copy here.
How
And
does-
I'm missing just one chapter 3, so we'll get to chapter 4 in a second. You on inside, okay. So, anyways, let me just see, give me a second. Okay, let's continue on. All right, so here's what we said. Just to summarize, we were talking about the difference between, we said, why will there be no more impurity and evil when Mashiach comes? We said, because God will be more revealed in everything. And when God, impurity and evil come when God is absent his revelation is absent. God is in everything, but when his revelation is absent, things think they control themselves, and things become self-absorbed. So we said, what is sinning? Sinning is when you disconnect from God. You're not following God anymore. You don't feel God is in control. When Mashiach comes, God will be revealed to the extent that there will be no more evil. He'll be revealed in every situation, everything will turn to him. So we said this is the difference between King Solomon and the coming of Mashiach. We said in the times of King Solomon, God was so revealed that there was peace in the world and everyone came to Solomon. But it only changed them when they felt God's presence. When they felt Solomon's presence, he was representing God. But when they didn't feel his presence, they went back to their old ways. So it's like in public they were behaving, but in private they didn't transform them fully. We said on the other hand, when Mashiach comes, God will be so revealed that even privately we will all behave properly. Right? Okay. Then we said this is the difference that we find in Tanya between a perfect tzaddik and an imperfect tzaddik. A perfect tzaddik despises evil. Again, evil doesn't mean Osama bin Laden. It doesn't mean, terrorism. Evil means anything that's not godly. That's what evil is. Not kosher. Anything that's not kosher, anything that's not godly, that is evil.
So, can something be not godly but not be evil?
Yeah.
Well, that thing that thing's mundane. Mundane means that either it could be used for evil or used for God. And our job is to use it for God. So the answer to the question is only for a limited amount of time. In other words, everything either has to be used for God or it ends up used for evil. So it doesn't remain, there's nothing that remains mundane.
So there's really no in between.
There's no in between. The world is created with in between potential, and our job is to use it for good. Right? So and if it's not used for good, then it ends up being not godly.
Are there some things that we can't utilize to change, like a pig or something?
Yes. So there's some things which are considered bad, ungodly. Our job is to stay away from them. That's how we utilize them. Then there's some things which are considered mundane. Our job is to use them out for good. And then there's some things which are holy. Our job is to involve ourselves with those things.
So if we take an inanimate object,
Yeah.
like a rock, now it could be used for good. It doesn't have any intrinsic or inherent qualities, except its physical description. It can be, and it might have been created thousands of years ago, right? Volcano, whatever. So it can be used for good or evil, right? It could
Correct.
be.
Everything in the world is created to serve the Jewish people's service to God, and everything in the world can be used for good or bad. Now, the difference between something mundane and something evil is something not kosher, you stay away from. Something mundane, you use out. So I'll give you an example. You have kosher food. Kosher food, you can eat it and make a blessing and eat it in the proper setting and use the energy to do good. You have elevated to the good side. Right?
Right.
You have non-kosher food, you can't elevate it. Nothing, you can't elevate it. A Jewish person's job is to stay away from it. Right? So that's the first chapter of Tanya.
Does it have some goodness in it, but we're not capable of reaching that goodness because God creates everything?
Well, so when we stay away from it, we reveal the good in it, right? But what's the difference? Mundane thing we ingest. That's how we reveal the good in it. Not evil thing, a bad thing, we don't ingest it. The way we reveal the good is by staying away from it. Okay, so now here's what the Tanya says. It says there are two types of service of God. There's sur meirah, turning away from evil, and there's mayaspera, despising evil. So what we said is most people, they don't despise bad things. And again, mundane things used not out for God. They control themselves. They have self-control. They work on themselves. I want to do the right thing. I want to do a good thing. A really righteous person, right? He despises not kosher. So let's take non-kosher for a second. You have a non-kosher donut. You really like it, actually. It's actually really good. Actually, I want to eat it. God says, don't eat it. Okay, I won't eat it. Do you despise it? No, I actually want it, right? A really righteous person, his emotional and intellectual build actually despise it because it's unholy. He feels disgusted by it. He feels disgusted by those things, right? So so now. So what's the difference between these two people? One person, he knows what he wants in life. He knows that he's a Jew. So he controls himself. He controls his animal. Because again, we spoke last week, human beings, Jews are essentially animals. We have instinct, right? And we want what we want. And we not necessarily can we change it that easily. But I choose not to eat it, right? Even though I want to eat it, even though I enjoy it, I choose not to do it. That's called sur mira. My internal organs want it, but I ultimately don't want it. I don't want it for a higher purpose. That's called sur mira, turning away from evil. A tzaddik is somebody who's very, very righteous. His internal organs are disgusted by it. He doesn't follow instinct. It's disgusting. But look, it's the same ingredients as the coach. I don't care. It's disgusting.
Is it not a choice? It's not a choice.
It's almost not a choice for him.
Almost not a choice.
Almost not a choice for him. Correct.
Okay.
So
Why-
now,
Why,
why almost not a
why
choice?
must you despise it to be a tzaddik?
Because he is disgusted by unholiness. He's not his animal is not in control. He's disgusted by holiness. He's through and through holy. That's what a tzaddik is. Someone whose organs are all holy. They're through and through infused with God. Most people, we're not through and through infused with God. On the contrary, if you would let us free for a day, who knows what we'd end up doing. Again, evil doesn't necessarily mean, we're not talking about evil going and murdering people. We're talking about acting, not following God, not being conscious of God. That's what we're talking about in Tanya. So that's the difference between sur mira and moyaspera. So even though externally now why is it that you don't despise the evil? Because inside you have what to work on. Inside you're friends with evil, right? You're made out of the same material. Your animal soul is made out of the same material as that thing. Right? You just have a godly soul which you want to listen to, right? So this is the difference between sur mira and moyaspera. So we mentioned last week. We said, should you say I like donuts and I'm not eating them, or should you say I don't like donuts and I'm not eating them? I don't want to think about them. I don't want to talk about them. So the Maggid of Mezrich said, if you're very righteous, you could say you like them. Because you don't really connect to it inside. But if you're not so righteous, you shouldn't say you like. You shouldn't involve yourself with it. Because as human beings with an animal soul, we're very, very vulnerable. So this is the difference between sur mira and moyaspera. Okay, so now we're going to connect that. We're going to say that the times of King Solomon were like sur mira. The world turned away from evil. So there was still evil there. There was still temptation to do idolatry. But the world turned away from it, right? Why? Because the world was inspired to turn away from it. But there was still inside, it wasn't fully transformed. On the other hand, in the times of Mashiach, the world will be fully transformed. So, one of the commentators, one of the Jewish traditions is, nowadays, you're not allowed to pick fruit on Shabbos. It's a sin, you're liable. When Mashiach comes, when you pick fruit, it says, the fruit will say, don't pick me, it's Shabbos. Right? The world will be totally infused with God. It won't be an option to sin. Now, we're basically animals, and we tame our animals. We tame them. We study Torah, we do mitzvahs, we read inspiring things. We try and stay away from dirty things because it might arouse us to do dirty things, right? So that's okay. So Aderes Rochilat Ben Gila Sheva Shlema, the Gila also. The Gila Sheva Shlema. Even though the times of Solomon, God was very tangible in the world and revealed in the world. And therefore it pushed away all evil. It pushed away all evil. But it pushed it away. Was the evil still there when it gets pushed away? Yeah, it's still there. The evil is still there. It's pushed away. It's not on the playing field. Right? It's still there though. It's not transformed. On the other hand, when Mashiach comes, the world will be in the status of a really righteous person who despises and is disgusted by evil, He's disgusted by evil. In other words, there is no evil anymore. His organs were transformed. The world will be transformed to totally good. All right. Now we're going to add one little paragraph and then we'll go inside. What determines how much you hate evil? How much you despise evil? Now we spoke last week, and the Rebbe is going to talk here. He's going to say, even though we all are attracted to evil, nevertheless, the fact that we're preparing for the coming Mashiach, we can transform ourselves a little bit, right? So what determines how much you hate evil and how much you despise evil? How much you're disgusted by evil? What are you going to say?
How much do we internalize good?
How much do you love God? The more you love God in your internal organs, the more you truly love God, and you don't love yourself. Human beings are conditioned to love themselves. We're worried about our honor and about ourselves more than anything. The more you can love God, that's the more you will despise anything which is not God.
Yeah.
So the tzaddik, it's not that he despises and is disgusted by evil. That's not step one. Step one is he loves God. He's internally, everything in his life is about God. And he sees everything in the world is about God. So anything outside of that he despises. Somebody who not everything in his life is dedicated to God, right? He doesn't feel the love of God in every part of his life. So then automatically that'll give space, then he'll give space for something evil. According to this, we can explain. In the times of Solomon, the godly revelation, the positive godly revelation was very, very strong. So it pushed away all evil. People didn't want to be evil in front of it, right? So the godly revelation was very strong. But it wasn't fully transformative. It was only partially transformative. On the other hand, when Mashiach comes, that the godly revelation in the world will be complete. There will be no space for anything outside of God, revealed godliness. So then the whole world will be transformed and there'll be no more death. There'll be no more death. That's why there'll be no more death, because God will be fully revealed. There'll be no more impurity, no more availability, no more free choice. No more free choice to sin, right? Because God will be fully revealed in everything.
So this despising or hatred of evil isn't really a thing in itself. It's a manifestation of the love of God.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. You know, so I'm reading this book about the Holocaust. So basically, this 13-year-old kid ended up smuggling tefillin into the concentration camp. Where he was in, I don't remember which train. He was in Birkenau. So, anyways, he had this tefillin, and the word got out in the concentration camp that this kid has tefillin, right? So certain Jews started coming every day to put tefillin on. One of them was like a certain Rebbe, who, you know, and he's shaved down. Remember, he's a holy, really holy tzaddik, and he goes and puts tefillin on. So someone tells him, they say, Rebbe. Now, this 13-year-old kid didn't even know he was a Rebbe, till afterwards, many years later, he read the diary of someone else who wrote, I told the Rebbe that there's a kid who wears tefillin, and some guy came. They worked out a time every day. You come by the window of this kid and his. So they asked the Rebbe. They said to him, they said, how could you put tefillin on you? You're going to lose. You're going to die if they find you wearing tefillin. He said, in the concentration camp, we're already basically dead. So any mitzvah you can do, you should do. That's what he told him. It's a very powerful story. Now I bet in the mind of that Rebbe's mind, it wasn't imaginable not to put tefillin on. It wasn't imaginable. In other words, he couldn't see a reality outside of putting tefillin. Save my life? What do you mean? Who's gonna save my life? God's gonna save my life, right? He couldn't see a reality outside putting tefillin on, right? So that's what a tzaddik is. A tzaddik's love is so great to God, and his consciousness of God is so perfect in everything, and therefore he never falls, and therefore he despises evil. Speaking about Holocaust survivors, this other Holocaust survivor I heard. So they were interviewing him, and we showed the video here several years ago. So there were two interesting things about his interview. One thing is, he said that they were going and they gave him some non-kosher salami in the trains. So his mother gave him non-kosher salami, and he ate it. She said, you have to eat it. It's not kosher. She said, well, you're going to die if you don't eat it. You have to eat it. So he ate it and he vomited it out. He said he was educated as a kid that non-kosher is so dirty. It's the worst thing in the world, non-kosher, that he couldn't swallow it. He couldn't swallow it. He vomited it out physically, right? The other thing they said about him, they said, did you ever ask where's God in the Holocaust? He said, no. He said, because I learned so many stories, miracle stories of Baal Shem Tov, which show that there are different levels of reality, that from a young age, from 5, 6 years old, I knew that God is in everything, and when we can't see it, He's present in a different reality. So a tzaddik here, we're saying, is someone who's so involved with God, and he knows that God is in everything so strongly that he despises evil. For the rest of us, we have animal souls. We have to be very careful, because not only our animal soul are we prone to following our animal soul, which is selfish and survival rated. Not only that, but he will convince us that we're doing the right thing. We're doing something, there's nothing wrong with it.
So is this a choice that your internal mechanisms, let's say, of godly love, overwhelm the evil inclination in such a way that these kinds of things happen? Do we believe that having that kind of reaction or manifestation is a choice? Could someone choose to be that developed?
They can choose to want it, but what are you going to do about it? That's your choice. You can choose to want it. The playing field that we have is an animal soul, a godly soul, evil inclination, all sorts of bad traits. That's the playing field that we are. Our choice is what we do about it. And we'll see soon, if you want to despise evil, you can't choose to despise evil. You can choose to want to despise evil. Then you can go into years of training, of studying about the love of God and studying about God and reality. And the Tanya says if you study those things, they'll eventually have an effect in your heart. Likely not to a complete stage until Mashiach comes. Likely something you'll always have to be working on your whole life and always adding more. And when you don't add more, likely you'll fall back into the way you were. So that's our choice. Our choice is what we want to invest in it day by day. So free choice is usually something which is a day by day choice. It's not something which you make one choice. So you can't choose what to love and what to hate. You can't choose what to love and what to hate. You can't choose your emotions. Your emotions are already pre-programmed.
Okay.
What you can do is you can choose to change your emotions. How do you change your emotions? That's the book of the Tanya. It's a long road to change your emotions, and you won't be able to do it fully according to Tanya until Mashiach comes.
So, a person, let's say, who keeps kosher and is Shomer Shabbos and so forth, by avoiding transgressions, because he or she knows it's the wrong thing to do, isn't considered a tzaddik, because they don't have the emotional wherewithal that we're talking about. Correct?
Correct.
So,
in other words,
that means,
very likely that person is doing all those things without pure godly intention, right? Because he doesn't fully love God.
exactly, that's what I'm saying.
Correct,
Because
correct.
it's a rational choice. So we're making a dichotomy, just to change the terminology a little bit, between a rational, say, considered decision. No, I won't violate the Shabbos. No, I won't eat treif. And a person who has the emotional, that the decision, it's not really a decision for that person. Their constitution, who prevents them from doing it, even thinking about it.
Correct.
So the person.
Well, what's just important to remember, choice is on many, many levels. So you might have a really righteous person who his choice might be, your choice might be, should I carry outside on Shabbos or not? And I'm not going to do it, and it's spur of the moment. And then next week there's a really tempting reason to do it, and then you do it, and I'm sorry, next thing I'm going to be better. And his might be in a very loftier soul. His might be, Should I study Talmud, legal things on Shabbos, or should I study mysticism on Shabbos? And for him, could be studying legal things on Shabbos is not Shabbos-dik enough. He should study mysticism. And it's not considered, ultimately it's not about did you sin or not. Ultimately it's about are you connecting to God to the fullest of your potential.
Understood. So let's, again, I want to describe
Yeah.
one level of this topic as a rational decision. I drove on Shabbos, now I'm not driving on Shabbos. It's a rational, considered decision. I organized my life so I can do that, but it's not emotional, it's rational. So that person cannot be a tzaddik because they don't have this overwhelming love of God that causes them to have a negative emotional response to things that are not permitted, right? I mean,
Well,
is
so-
that
so-
a correct?
All right, so the word rational kind of throws me off, but basically correct. A tzaddik is somebody who there's no other choice in his mind. There's no, because
Right.
he's totally God. He's a godly person. A regular person has an animal soul. So when we make choices, when we make choices, sometimes our choices might seem righteous and they might even be selfish. We don't know. The Tanya says, just try and do the right thing. Try and do what God wants. Because if you calculate too much, if you're doing it with pure reason or not pure reason, that's also selfish. What does God want you to do? And just follow what God wants you to do. So that's a term called actually Kabbalah Soul. Kabbalah Soul means to accept the yoke of heaven. Accept the yoke of heaven means I am going to follow the right thing, no matter what I feel or what I think. So that's a very high level of service that we do.
So if we have a observant person who's not a tzaddik in this thing that we're talking about, what's God's view of that person as opposed to the tzaddik in this conversation? You observe the law, but you're not disgusted by evil. You know it's the wrong thing to do, and you choose not to do it, but you're still tempted by it, and the tzaddik throws up, as you described. So how does God view these two people who have two different reactions to observing or not observing the law?
So we learned in chapter 31, we said that you can never judge another person because you don't know how much a person is dedicating to God compared to someone else. You can never compare two people. So what is God looking for in us? He's not looking for a checklist of how many good things we do. He's looking for how hard are we trying to serve him? How hard are we trying to serve him? So you can have someone who's very, very good at doing things and he's disgusted, but he has never served. This is what the Torah says. This is what we said in Tanya. You can't really compare any two people. And we have no ability because we never know what is the base form, what is the playing field for this person, and how hard are they trying. Because my trying and your trying might be different situations. We can never prove it to each other and everything because we can never ultimately compare what our soul's mission is. So what God wants from every person is to give everything they can to him. That's what God wants, just like a wife. But we cannot compare these two people. So the tzaddik, God might say, hey, you're doing a great job, you're perfect, but you need to help other people. You're not trying enough to help other people. And to the other person, he might say, hey, you kept one mitzvah, one time in your life, you kept Shabbos for 5 minutes. That was a lot of work. We can't. So when we're talking about internal organs, we're talking about emotions and thoughts, that we can't really judge people because we don't know where the playing field starts. No two people. It's not like God made a bunch of comparable robots and put souls in them and there's a race. Every body is perfectly built and every soul is perfectly built for that person to go and work with that to try and get close to God. So we can't really judge who's...
But it does sound like it sounds like a hierarchy is being created where the tzaddik is despised by evil or hates evil, and the other person is a lesser person in God's eyes.
No, that's incorrect. There's no such thing as a lesser person in God's eyes.
It would be more like a child compared to an adult.
There's no such thing as a lesser
God
person
loves
in
both
God's
the
eyes.
child
I'm just trying to
and the
understand.
Yeah, so there's-
I'm not making an assertion.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to
So
understand.
let me put it another way. There is no such thing as a lesser person or more person in God's eyes. It's like every person has the unique potential in their relationship with God, that their job is to fulfill what they need for their relationship. So the tzaddik is the hierarchy of a tzaddik and a regular person is not really so internal. It's more of an external hierarchy. It's like I have the ability to see, and he doesn't have the ability to see, right? So I can do certain mitzvahs that he can't do. Am I higher than him? No. Am I better than him? No, because God didn't try and shoot vision at him and miss. God wanted him to do a mission that doesn't involve vision. So it's like, so there isn't really a hierarchy in getting closer to God. In other words, a tzaddik might be perfect in every way, but if he's alive, he still didn't fulfill his mission. And then you might have someone else who's imperfect, but he fulfilled his mission. He used the tools he had to get closer to God. So it's really, if you think about it, it's really not black and white at all. We all have, to work on ourselves. Every human has to work on themselves, and they all have a special mission cut out for them. That if God wanted you to be a tzaddik, and that to be your playing field, He would have put you in that situation.
You would be a tzaddik.
You would have been a tzaddik. But if He didn't want you to be a tzaddik, He wants you to work in that specific situation. So in Judaism, actually, there isn't really a hierarchy. The whole tzaddik thing, which you really have to learn in Tanya, the whole tzaddik of leading the way, it's like tzaddikim actually on the contrary. The Tanya says, why are there tzaddikim? Why are there righteous people in the world? Because God saw that if there weren't people like the Rebbe, all the other people would fall off. We'd fall off. We wouldn't be able to fulfill our mission. So He puts people who have their head on straight, to guide the people who don't have their head on straight. So let's think about it. Who's more important? The righteous person who's leading, or the people who are being guided, right? Let's think about it. If not for the people, there wouldn't be a tzaddik, right? So the tzaddik knows my job isn't just to sit in my glory and be perfect. My job is when I go and meet somebody who's imperfect, they will see someone who has confidence in God, right? So the tzaddik really looks at himself like he is a emissary of God to help people, and that's his mission. And if the people aren't helped, then he's not fulfilling his mission. And that's, and he knows I have to keep working until I fulfill my mission. That's what a tzaddik is. So actually it says that God saw the world was a tough place and it wouldn't be able to exist. So He had mercy. And the Midrash says, what's mercy? God threw in godly inspiration once in a while. Let people get inspired. Because if we wouldn't get inspired once in a while, we would lose it. And He also put in perfect people. He put in once in a while Moses to communicate God to us, because otherwise we would be too disconnected.
Right.
So that's how tzaddikim work. And it's like, basically, to sum it up, the only day you could rest in God's realm, that even though, how can we say we can be